Evening. I'm so glad all of you have joined us here in person and online for Our Backyard. How can we support wildlife and the ecological integrity of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem with our honored guest, George Wuerthner. This is the 8th in a series of Earth Day talks, and it's the final talk that we've put on this year with our theme of wildlife. And it's culminating in our annual Earth Day Festival, which is on Saturday, April 22nd at the Emerson. And there's a little something for everyone, as you can see on the screen there. Also that day, this year, we're again having a fun run, which is being held at the Gallatin County Regional Park at 9 a.m. If you haven't already registered by that day, they will take same day registrations from 8 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. And this year, all the money raised is benefiting the Indraland Audubon Wetland Preserve. In case you don't know, it's a great little wetland that the Sacagawea Audubon is in charge of, and it's just a block off of the east side of Main Street, downtown Bozeman here. So it's a great cause. And then in that evening, we have an Earth Day variety show. It's also at the Emerson, and at 6:30 the doors open because we're helping out the Bozeman High School Solar Schools Club. They are going to have a silent auction to raise money to put solar panels on the schools in our community. And then at 7:30, the show starts, and it'll be really fun. It's just a variety show with some music, some comedy, a game show featuring some of our local wildlife crossing experts, because that is the theme for the evening, wildlife crossing. So that should be a lot of fun. And they're asking for a $10 donation at the door to help cover costs, but it's only optional. So I guess I should introduce myself now. My name is Ann Reddy, and I am chair of the Gallatin Valley Earth Day Committee. And I'm so thrilled, as I said earlier, to have George Wuerthner with us tonight. I first heard George speak, 2 or 3 years ago at a Sacagawea Audubon meeting, and I have to say that I was just blown away by it. I had moved here in 2015, and I knew it was a really cool place, and I appreciated the wildlife in the area, but honestly, I had no idea how special and unique this place was until I heard George talk about it, and it really changed my whole outlook. It was really one of those light bulb moments, like, oh wow, I had no idea. So I'm just thrilled that he's coming back again here to Bozeman and give a talk for us tonight. I was just curious in the audience, I said this is the 8th of our talks. Could I have a show of hands? How many of you have attended at least one of the previous 7 talks? Oh, almost everyone. Great. Well, if there's one talk you wished you would have seen and you missed, don't worry, because all our talks this year have been recorded and they're out on our Gallatin Valley Earth Day YouTube channel. And you can get there by going to gallatinvalleyearthday.org and click on the YouTube button. And then you have a whole variety of great talks that you can watch at your leisure. So I will introduce George in a moment, but before that, I just really want to give a big thank you to our partner this evening, which is the Gallatin Wildlife Association. They do a lot of really great work to support wildlife in our area, so I strongly encourage you to check them out at their website, which is gallatinwildlife.org. And lastly tonight, this evening would not happen without the support from a lot of community nonprofits, organizations, government agencies. And first of all, I'd like to thank our fiscal sponsor, which is Greater Gallatin United Way, which handles all our money. And then our premier sponsors, which are the City of Bozeman, Audi Bozeman, and Gallatin Subaru. And we have benefactor sponsors, Sacagawea Audubon Society, Montana Parents Magazine, and our stewards, which include Happy Trash Can, Valley of the Flowers Landscaping, Bozeman Green Build, of course, Gallatin Wildlife Association, and Valley of the Flowers Project, which is a nonprofit that does a lot of great work in our community. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank our great technical support for tonight that makes this all run smoothly. Lorraine Reed from Sacagawea Audubon Society, and Rich Reddy is sitting right here running things in person, and he'll also be helping us with our question and answer section. And of course, I'd really like to thank Hope Lutheran Church for providing this venue for us. And so now I am almost ready to introduce George, but before I do that, I just have to run through a little logistics here. If you are joining us online, I want to say, and in person, after George gets done talking, we will have a question and answer period then. And if you are joining us online, you need to look to the right side of your screen, and there's a little column there. And if you go partway down that column, there's a place that says questions. And that is where you type in your question. And then Rich here will feed or read your questions to George when the time comes. If you're in our in-person audience, I will be grabbing a microphone, and I just need you to raise your hand and I will bring the microphone over to you. And the microphone is very important because that way the online folks can hear your question as well as people here in the audience. Well, now, without further ado, as they say, I am ready to introduce George Wuerthner, and I'm so excited about this. And George Wuerthner is an ecologist, he is a writer, and he is a photographer. And he has published 38 books, including Protecting the Wild, Parks and Wilderness, The Foundation for Conservation, Keeping the Wild Against the Domestication of Earth, Wildfire, A Century of Failed Forest Policy, Montana, Magnificent Wilderness, and 3 books on the Yellowstone National Park. Now, George has extensive on-the-ground experience with protected landscapes, and he has visited more than 400 designated wilderness areas, 200 national parks, and all of the national forests in the West. Quite an accomplishment. He has previously taught environmental studies and ecology field courses at a number of universities. He has also worked as a botanist and a biologist with the Idaho BLM. He has been a wilderness guide in Alaska, a river ranger on several Alaskan wild and scenic rivers, and last but not least, a backcountry ranger in the gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska. Quite a resume here. So yeah, I'd like you to please welcome George to the stage with a nice round of applause, and I'll hand over the microphone to him.
Okay. Is this working okay for voice? Okay. I put this in just as to put a pitch for a new movie that's come out called Wildlife. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you. It's about Doug and Chris Tompkins' efforts to protect create national parks and protect Patagonia. And I worked for Doug Tompkins, that's on the left there with the camera, for about a dozen years. And when I got hired by Doug, it's kind of amusing. He called me up and said, we'd like to hire you full time. And this is your job description. You're to research and write books. You're to take photographs for the books. You're to give talks about the books. And the last thing, and this is verbatim, I have it written down, I am to periodically visit North American wildlands to assess the general condition of the landscape, which I took to mean, well, whenever I'm out hiking, I'm doing my job. And you can take time off whenever you feel it's appropriate. Work whenever you want. You can live wherever you want. And once a month, send me a letter and tell me what you're doing. And so when he offered that job, I had to think about it for about 1 second and took it. So anyway, this is a picture down in Patagonia, New Year's Eve. We were traveling around for about a month looking at sites that could be purchased for new national parks. And there's a new movie out that I don't know if it's been shown in Bozeman yet. Oh, it was. Okay. Well, if you get a chance to see it, it's worth trying to see. Anyway, so we'll get on to this Greater Yellowstone past, present, and future. And I have to tell you, I've been working on this thing for days now. I keep taking things off and putting new slides in and changing things around, and I'm exhausted. And in fact, I only finished this about 15 minutes ago, the last time I saved it. So we'll see how it goes here. I want you to understand that Yellowstone is, one of the most unique places in the world, the whole Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It's the largest intact temperate ecosystem we have anywhere. So this is a unique situation here. You may not appreciate it because you live right here and you don't understand from a global perspective how unique it is. It has all the wildlife species it possessed at its creation in 1872. And the question is, can we keep it into the future? And the other thing I want to say here, there are probably misspelled words in here and anything like that because I was writing this thing up at the last minute. So hopefully I won't have too many of them. Anyway, it's been an inspiration for conservation around the world. There are now more than 100 countries that have national parks, and it was because of Yellowstone's establishment. And a lot of other things happened in the Yellowstone ecosystem. It was the first effort to save endangered species, bison. It was the first national forest in the United States was established, the Yellowstone Forest Reserve on what is now the Shoshone National Forest on the east side of the park. And it was the first public lands to ban predator control, promote natural processes like wildfire and native fish. This ecosystem, depending upon where you want to draw the boundaries, is between 23 and 26 million acres. So that's about the size of Maine and New Hampshire put together. So it's a pretty good piece of chunk of land. And most of it, as you can see, the green there are national forests. The sort of purple, I guess you would call it, is Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. And we have some national wildlife refuges like the Elk Refuge and also state lands in that area too. So all these public lands give us a great opportunity that you don't have in a lot of other places because we, the people of the United States, have a say over how those lands are taken care of. And it's also been recognized as an international biosphere reserve and World Heritage Site. So it's gotten this international recognition. So who are the original inhabitants of GYE? Well, it was wildlife. A lot of these species were here before any humans came into North America. And then we had this migration of what they're called Paleo-Indians. And there's different theories about when this happened and how it happened. One theory, as you can see, is there was a coastal route and got into South America. Others, after the ice ages, the glaciers separated enough that people could come down along the front of the ice age into North America. And I'm not up on the latest of this, but one of the interesting things is there's a remains of a child found near Livingston. And I think it was supposed to be 13,000 years old. And the interesting thing is genetically, it is most closely related to tribal people down in South America. And so one theory is that that was a relic, or how can you say, it was the first people here, and then other people came in after that and sort of swamped genetically or, whatever, displaced them. And I'm going to get to a point here, but in those Paleo Indians and future tribal people were hunting mostly on foot. And you have to think about how dangerous that was and how inefficient it was too. You had things like buffalo jumps where you could get, a lot of animals killed at one time, but that took very special circumstances to get something like that. What really changed for the tribal people in this area was the adoption of the horse, which in a sense is sort of like a new technology, because you could chase up to the bison. You could from the safety of a horse, kill lots of bison. And it also led to mobility of tribal people. And this is a map showing, the horse came in with the Spanish and then was spread northwards. There was just a paper a week ago came out, said that it was a little earlier that tribes maybe have gotten horses, but it doesn't change the fact that the horse was a new technology in a sense. And before the horse arrived, there were people using parts of Yellowstone Park like Obsidian Cliff for obsidian, and of course seasonally hunting bison and other wildlife in what is now Yellowstone Park. And I'm going to be talking Greater Yellowstone and Yellowstone Park, and I'll try to keep those two things separated or specific what I'm talking about because it makes a difference. So the horse led to, this is one of the things that was real interesting. When the horse came about, a lot of tribes moved on to the plains that weren't there before because they could colonize and exploit bison herds. So this is a map showing basically around when Yellowstone was established, the main tribes that were around this area. So you had the Blackfeet and the Gros Ventres up near the Canadian border, the Crow to the east of Yellowstone. You can see the corner here. Can I walk out here? Yeah, just to show you. This would be where Yellowstone was, right here. Okay, so Flathead and Shoshone down here in the yellow. So those were the tribes most associated with the Yellowstone area. And the first historic reference to Greater Yellowstone was the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I'm going to go over some things that they said because it's pretty interesting. William Clark, you may remember, maybe you don't know, Lewis and Clark separated around Missoula. Lewis went back along the Blackfoot River over to the Missouri River with a bunch of men, and Clark came down the Bitterroot Valley and into the Big Hole Valley and over into the Gallatin Valley. And what he said, we saw several antelope, deer, wolves, beaver, otter, hawks, crows, wild geese. And by the way, that's not my misspelling. Although my word check would try to change these things, but I tried to keep the words as they wrote them. During the day, we passed several buffalo roads, that was his spelling, all leading to a gap in the mountains, Bridger Pass. I proceeded about 2 miles, crossing those different channels, all of which were dammed with beaver in such a manner as to render passage impractical after swamped, as I may say, in this bottom of beaver. And then they got by Kelly Creek right over here, but towards the university, a little past, said immense, that's how you spell it, quantities of beaver on the fork and their dams very much impede the navigation from Three Forks. After crossing to the Yellowstone River by Livingston, Clark noted the Shields River had great numbers of beaver. By the present day, Big Timber, he named two streams, Otter River, which was Sweetgrass Creek, and Beaver River, Lower Deer Creek, because of the abundance. And he noted several gangs of 100 to 200 elk and great numbers of antelope. And by the way, he didn't see any buffalo all this way. All the way from the Bitterroot Valley, the first buffalo they sighted was a little past Big Timber, and then they didn't really see any big ones, herds that is, until they got further down the Yellowstone. And then when they, by the time they got down like where Billings is, that area, he said, for me to mention or give an estimate of different species of wild animals on this river, especially buffalo, elk, antelope, and wolves, would be incredible. I shall therefore be silent on the subject further. And I'm going to make a point here. One of my favorite things is to read all these early journals of fur trappers and explorers and whatever. And 1811, the hunt party on the Upper Green River in Wyoming, where Pinedale, Wyoming is, if you know that area, the Wind River Range. He says, we are surrounded by mountains in which were disclosed beautiful green valleys where numerous herds of bison grazed, which made them much more interesting to us because for several days we had not seen a single one of these animals. He also noted the Upper Green abounded in beaver and otter. And then Robert Stewart's party on the Grays River, which is, if you know where Alpine, Wyoming is, comes out there. The later part of our way being through beaver ponds and quagmires, where our progress was slow indeed, and water courses of every size and description, which we have seen since we left the Crows, that's the Crow Indians. The beaver have, by their dams, inundated all the low ground and are in abundance wherever there is a possibility of a place to live. And then another quotes from Stewart, immense quantities of beaver inhabit the Mad River and its tributaries. That was near Pocatello. Later, the party camps on Teton River below Driggs, Idaho. On reaching the low grounds are dammed by beaver and occasion the swamps through which we pass today. And the reason I wanted to bring all this up, and I could have given you many more examples, is we have no idea what this place looked like. We cannot even imagine. Imagine this whole Gallatin Valley was just crowded with beaver dams that these, like Clark was complaining, we can hardly get through it. And what did all those beaver dams do? It slowed the water flooding from the spring floods. It trapped sediment. I would say that the agricultural lands in the Gallatin Valley are a direct result of having beaver dams covering the whole valley at one time. And it stopped all that sediment. And you've got these deep soils. And it also created a lot of wildlife habitat. So I call it landscape amnesia. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some other things along here that way too, that it's hard for us, unless you read all these journals and read a lot of them, to to grasp how much the landscape has changed from what it was like a couple hundred years ago. Now, I want to talk about another thing that, the trapping era started, and it's kind of an interesting thing, the difference between trapping in Canada versus the United States. In Canada, Indians did all the trapping for beaver and whatever else they trapped, otter, etc. And the voyagers took trade goods by canoe to permanent trading posts. But in the Rockies, rivers like the Missouri allowed for large cargo boats, including steamboats that started up, they were coming to Fort Union by 1832. That's pretty early. They were getting boats all the way up the Missouri. And that allowed them to carry heavier furs, bison hides. So in Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company and the other fur companies weren't interested in bison hides because they couldn't transport them in canoes. They had to make portages and portages and portages. But here we had rivers, I'm talking about not only in Missouri, you had the Platte, you had the Arkansas, all these rivers coming out of the Rockies that you could take fur and other heavy goods on by boat. And so that changed sort of like the fur trade in a way. And so the fur trapping era began in 1806. Lewis and Clark already, even when they came up the Missouri River, ran into fur trappers with the Mandan villages that were coming, French fur trappers. But what we call this area here, the height of the fur trapping era, the era of the mountain men, was 1820s through the 1840s. And the reason it basically started to end in the 1840s is beaver were getting scarce, despite all those quotes that I was giving you earlier about how beaver were everywhere. They were getting trapped pretty thoroughly. And there weren't that many people. At the height of the fur trade, it's estimated between Mexico and Canada, there were about 1,000 trappers. But they were pretty efficient at what they were doing. And one of the reasons they were efficient, they changed the way that they trapped. They had these rendezvous. Most of them were in Wyoming or in Idaho. And what would happen is the trappers would stay year round then in the mountains trapping. And that allowed them, that's one of the ways they could be efficient. And then pack trains from St. Louis would bring the trade goods, and they would meet in the summer at these rendezvous and exchange beaver hides for whatever goods they needed. And the interesting thing about that too is that people don't realize, we have this whole image from Jeremiah Johnson of like this trapper going by himself out there. Actually, they were called fur brigades. They'd often have 100 or 150 people in a trapping thing, and they would travel partly for protection from Indians and partly because some of them, a lot of these fur trappers were married to Indian wives. They'd bring their families along and so forth. So it was like a little community out there, and they'd go out daily and maybe trap a stream, but then they come back to the group. Let's see. Anyway, the wildlife abundance, Dan Flores, he's a historian, called it the American Serengeti. So I'm going to give you some quotes again for this landscape amnesia. William Ferris was a trapper who kept a journal, and in 1832 in Little Jackson Hole, which is along the Hobuck River, if you know that, between Jackson and Pinedale, it was covered with herds of buffalo. We came upon a vast plain descending to the Green River. The plain was literally covered with buffalo. Found a large herd of buffalo in the Jackson Hole Valley. Near the base of the Wind River Range, Ferris noted immense herds of bison in every direction. And Captain Bonneville, which led another trapping party in 1833 on the Green River, noted it was strewn in every direction with the carcasses of buffalo. It was evident that the Indians had recently been there in great numbers. Osborne Russell was another trapper. He's got a book called Journal of a Trapper, and that's really fascinating to read. But he traveled around for about 10 years here. In 1834 on the Hams Fork, which is down past Kemmer, Wyoming, if you kind of know where that part of the landscape is, abounds with buffalo, antelope, bear, and elk are abundant. 1835 on the Salt River Valley, which is near Alpine, Wyoming, Russell reported thousands of buffalo carelessly feeding in the green vales. Near present-day Dubois, Wyoming, Russell saw thousands of bighorn sheep. On the Shields River by Livingston, he saw immense bands of buffalo intermittent with bands of antelope. Further down the Yellowstone, basically near Billings, he said thousands of buffalo were seen in every direction. Deer, elk, and grizzly are abundant. That was another thing. if you read all these journals, man, they saw grizzly bears all over the place, lots of them. Russell's party camped near the mouth of the Clark Fork River at the confluence with the Yellowstone, where thousands of fat buffalo were feeding on the plain. And then, not to give a false impression, there were a lot of times when they didn't see any game too. So I can give you those quotes, but there were lots of places where there was they were starving actually. There was no game. And that's because the bison were mobile. They moved around a lot. And so they might be in a valley one day, and then, 2 days later, they're gone. They're 100 miles away, maybe. Anyway, on the Green River, he said, here we expected to find buffalo in abundance, but all we found were a few bull tracks. Having been without food but a beaver for nearly a week, a member of the party suggested lots be cast and one die to preserve the others. In other words, we'll eat him, whoever pulls the short end of the straw. And Jim Kleiman near the Wind River Range noted buffalo scarce and rations limited. Our stock of dried being very scant, we soon ran out entirely. No game to be found. And I can give you quite a few quotes just like that too. So I want you to have the idea that there was lots of these herds, but they were mobile and moving around, and they reacted to the presence of people hunting them. Sometimes that would chase them out of an area, just like any other predator. So beaver were not the only fur. While white trappers pursued beaver, Indians traded bison hides for things they could not produce, like guns, ammo, metal pots. The incentive to kill more bison was driven in part by warfare. Tribes with guns could defeat tribes without guns. For example, the Blackfeet, who are up around Glacier Park, that's where the reservation is today, were moving across Canada. A lot of these tribes we know something about their movements because of their language. The Blackfeet are Algonquin speakers from Eastern Canada, and they were gradually moving across what's Canada now. And when they first got to the area around Glacier Park, they displaced the Flathead who were living there. And they had an advantage because they got guns from the Hudson's Bay Company, and the Flathead hadn't gotten guns yet. So getting guns was very essential to, maintaining your territory and avoiding getting your lands taken away. And there was another thing that happened because of the hide trade and meat preferably. Killing cow bison was in greater demand. So that had effects on bison herds. Their numbers started to decline in a lot of places because you're taking the most productive part of the population out. So the shipment of hides possible in the Missouri led to the gradual bison extirpation. And this map on here shows how the original range, and then as we go through time, eventually bison were down to just a few dots in the western U.S. And here's some quotes. In 1830, the whole country lying around the Yellowstone, the tributaries and headwaters of the Missouri abounded not only in beaver, but in buffalo, bear, elk, and antelope. Indeed, buffalo used to cross the mountains about the headwaters of the Snake and Colorado rivers in such numbers, Colorado River being the Green River in Wyoming, in such numbers that at certain seasons of the year, the plains and river bottoms swarm with them. Since that day, they have quite disappeared from the western slope of the Rocky Mountains and are no longer seen in the same numbers on the eastern side. This is 1830. That's pretty early. And then here's another quote. The hunting of buffalo, which author Douglas Branch reports, the Métis, I don't know how to say that correctly, residing in the Red River Valley in Manitoba, killed over 650,000 bison in a 20-year period. By 1847, bison were extirpated from Manitoba, northern Minnesota, and North Dakota. So this is quite early. The bison herds are shrinking down geographically. And then the competition, because of this, was so important to the different people. By 1849, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs wrote that the destruction of bison herds must be at no late date so far diminished as chief resource of their subsistence and trade as to not only entail upon them great suffering, it will bring different tribes into competition in their hunting expeditions and lead to bloody collisions and exterminating wars between them. So this is 1849. And that was what happened. Warfare between tribes increased, where they tried to, the best places, like the best best place in Montana was the lower Yellowstone in that area for bison, and the Crow Indians occupied that. But they were constantly having to fight off the Blackfeet and the Sioux and all these other tribes that were after that same resource. And commercial hunting that we know about began in earnest after the Civil War, and a lot had to do with the arrival of rails, kind of just like boats on the Yellowstone allow shipment of heavy hides. Once the railroads came across, that opened up also to other areas to exploitation. And after the Civil War, you had all these ex-soldiers, particularly from the South, Confederates, who were good sharpshooters, and they didn't have any jobs, they didn't have anything to go back to, so they came out west and they started shooting bison like crazy. And so that alarmed Congress. This is another one of those things you hardly ever hear, but in 1874, Congress passed a law to make it unlawful for any non-Indian to kill any female buffalo of any age in the Western Territories. And it passed both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House, and Ulysses Grant, who was president, supported it, but he missed the brief window for signing the legislation into law. And so it didn't become a legal law at that time. And then the bill was reintroduced in 1876. And if you know your history, in 1876, a guy named Custer got annihilated out there on the Little Bighorn. And then that changed the attitude of the public towards trying to preserve bison things. But the other thing that was going on was that there were new laws passed after the Civil War, during the Civil War and after. So the Homestead Act was passed in 1862, I think it was. You had the Timber and Stone Act, Railroad Acts, Desert Entry Land Act, Mining Law of 1872. And all this was designed to get people to settle the West. And so what we're seeing is we're getting this settlement and exploitation starting to encroach even more on the whole Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. That's the point I'm trying to get across to you. And the first gold strikes, that brought the first real white settlement to Montana. Before that, you had some guys living at fur trapping trading posts like Fort Benton, but basically there was no settlement. So Grasshopper Creek, which was Bannock, was 1863. And this is another, I'm going to step back. It's really cool. Okay, you had the California Gold Rush in 1849, and all these people in California. And if you show a map of the West and you put California and you put that as your central point, you can see like ripples going out from California, because after they got to California and found gold, then people started saying, well, I wonder if there's gold in other places. So then you go and you find 1850s, there was gold mining in Oregon. Then 1860s, it was into Western Idaho. And then by the 1860s, it was in Montana and so forth, all the way to where they started looking for gold in Alaska in the late 1890s and early 1900s. So it's like concentric rings going out from this one point where they looked for gold. And so in this area, we had a Last Chance Gulch in 1864, immigrant, Montana and Cook City. Okay, both of these are surrounding and really close to Yellowstone. So prospectors were the next explorers, and they were out there wandering around through Yellowstone looking for gold. And there's some journals from some of those guys. And this is in the 1860s. And okay, so the fur trappers were there in the 1830s and so forth, going across Yellowstone, but most of them didn't write anything about it. A few like Osborne Russell. And then we got these gold miners. And in between, there wasn't a whole lot of people in terms of white people recording what they saw in that area. And then market hunting to supply meat to the mining camps started to take a real big impact on wildlife in the whole region. So like the Bottler's Ranch at Immigrant, you can see all the furs lining underneath that shed there. They killed thousands of animals a year, and they would sell it to the mining camps like Bannock and other places. And the Bozeman Trail was established in 1864 for miners going to the gold fields. And they started at Fort Laramie in Wyoming, came up through along the Bighorn Mountains to Billings area, up the Yellowstone River, over the pass, Bozeman Pass, into the Bozeman Valley. And Bozeman was mostly a trade center. There was not mining right here. And John Bozeman was killed in 1867. And that led to demands that the Army be, there weren't very many Army people in the West before the Civil War. There was a few forts. And after the Civil War, there still weren't a lot because Congress didn't want to support having a lot of soldiers out here. But enough demand came that they erected Fort Ellis right out here in 1867 to protect people on the Bozeman Trail. And then that led to some of the curiosity about Yellowstone. So I don't know if you can see these names so well, but the guy in the upper left-hand corner is Washburn, which Mount Washburn in Yellowstone is named for. Then you have Lieutenant Doan on the right, and then Cornelia Hedges, and then Everett's, Truman Everett's, who got lost on one of the expeditions and for 37 days wandered around Yellowstone starving and was rescued and survived. Anyway, you had the Cook, Flosum, Peterson expedition, which was just a bunch of miners. Then the Washburn, Langford, Doan expedition in 1870, and then Ferdinand Hayden Valley is named for, led an expedition, scientific, he was a geologist, and they had biologists and so forth on their expeditions. And when Hayden got done with his 1871, he traveled back east to promote the park idea. And he wrote an article in Scribner's magazine and featured Thomas Moran paintings. Mount Moran and Grand Teton National Park is named for Thomas Moran. And William Henry Jackson's photos led to the creation of Yellowstone National Park in 1872. And there wasn't much debate about creating the park. It just, and then the other thing I want to point out is it was made primarily for geological wonders. It wasn't for wildlife or anything that we think is important today. And that's a really important point to keep in mind, that our values today, whatever it might be, wasn't necessarily the same values that existed 100 years ago. So, oh, I mentioned that. Okay, it wasn't to make a rich man's hunting preserve. You will hear some people say that it was established, Yellowstone was to create a pristine wilderness. And I can guarantee you, if you read all these journals, all these people traveling Yellowstone knew there were people there because they were worried about losing their scalps. So there was no doubt that the person in that time era, they knew that people lived in this region. Okay, so the park law says that it was withdrawn from settlement and occupancy and sale. And that is a really amazing thing to have happened, because there was a lot of local opposition, just like you hear today whenever somebody proposes conservation things around the West. The Helena Gazette declared the creation of Yellowstone was a great blow to the prosperity of the towns of Bozeman and Virginia City. And it was manifest destiny after the Civil War. And the main government goal was to give away land. And in all these, they had all these acts, like I said, that would cause settlement. And in the midst of all that, we set aside Yellowstone Park. Just think about how incredible that was in the circumstances. And if it hadn't been done, if you remember some of the dates I was giving you about those mining camps, Emigrant Gulch and Cook City, if it had been a decade later, we wouldn't have Yellowstone Park today. I guarantee you it would have been branches, it would have been mining camps, it would have been taken over for something else. So it just sort of happened in the nick of time. One of the myths I hear all the time, though, is that Indians were driven from Yellowstone to create the park. Now, you gotta, if you know Yellowstone, it's a high plateau, about averages 8,000 feet in elevation. It's got snow most of the year. And tribes went there in the summer. They hunted there, they collected obsidian and so forth. But especially the tribes that had horses. These Plains Indian tribes had sometimes thousands of horses, and they needed large pasturages. And if you know Yellowstone, there aren't any big places where you're going to pasture 10,000 horses or 20,000 horses. So it was just impossible to stay there. And then because of the deep snow, the wildlife migrated. A lot of it left what we call Yellowstone, went to lower valleys, and that's where people went. They followed the wildlife. The other thing about Yellowstone that you have to keep in mind is that almost all these tribes had signed treaties before Yellowstone even got discussed as a park. So you had the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie, and that was the Cheyenne, Sioux, Arapaho, Crow, and the Silverline. 1855 Treaty, Nez Perce. I'm not going to list all the tribes, but you can see 1855, 1859, 1861, and 1868. So every tribe that was in the surrounding areas around Yellowstone was already on a reservation before any of those expeditions went in there and started talking about, why don't we save this place as a park? So that's the other thing is that if you look at the places that The Indians they lived in the same places we live today. You know, if you had a choice between being at 8,000 feet with 10 feet of snow, or you could be around Billings and have buffalo herds all around, where would you live? And so that was the same thing as we do today. Indian tribes were restricted to make the other thing was they were restricted to reservations to make it safe for settlement and exploitation, not to protect wildlife or geological wonders and all that. That's why we wanted to clear them out and off the land. And the other thing to keep in mind is the first 14 years of the park, there was no more than 1 or 2 employees, superintendent, 1 assistant. They didn't even live in the park except in summer. So you had Nathaniel Langford, which Mount Langford in the park's named for, and then Philetus Norris Geyser Basin. And, you know, again, it's sort of like, who was going to drive Indians out of the park? You got 1, 2 guys. They're going to, you know, drive whole tribes out. So if you really think about it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. After the park passage, Congress basically forgot about it. They got on to other things, and market hunting and the destruction of geysers, et cetera, was degrading the park. So one part-time superintendent couldn't stop all this stuff. So he had a massive amount of hunting happen on. When the park legislation was created, it prohibited wanton killing of game, which was one of the first efforts, by the way, to protect wildlife in the United States. But between 1871 and 1884, there was a continuous slaughter of wildlife in and around the park. So, like, for example, in 1872, Joseph Savage with the Hayden expedition reported the Butler brothers sold 301 elk skins, 250 deer and antelope, and 555 wolf skins. They used to kill the wolves with strychnine. They were paid $2,991. Thousands of elk were reported killed by Gardner annually in the first couple of decades. So this wildlife massacre was happening not just in Yellowstone, but all around. I remember when I was researching one book, I came across a newspaper article from Pocatello that was published in like 1910 or something like that. And the headline was 8 deer seen outside of Pocatello. And it made the front page because deer were so rare then. Can you imagine seeing a headline today? You know, you walk around, the deer are running all over the place in Bozeman. But back then, there was virtually no wildlife left in a lot of the West. So to deal with this, there was no National Park Service. So the U.S. Army was stationed in the park in 1886 to enforce regulation and protect park features. And the Army also was stationed in Yosemite after that was established as well. So these guys were out there and they were trying to stop the poaching and the hunting primarily. They built a lot of the roads. And the other thing about all these expeditions I mentioned, as well as the Army, they all went the same routes. I mean, you know, it's sort of like the roads that are in Yellowstone today that, you know, start at Mammoth and they go over to Tower Junction, then they go up to over Mount Washburn and down to the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, over the Yellowstone Lake and around to the Old Faithful Basin and then down the north. That's the route everybody was doing for 150 years practically. Anyway, and this is a surprising thing, which I did not know of until pretty recently, was that the Boone and Crockett Club was one of the most powerful and active conservation groups of the era. You know, Teddy Roosevelt, George Bird Grinnell, Charles Sheldon, some General Phil Sheridan, et cetera, were among the prominent men of the era. And they initiated legislation for the first national parks, including Glacier, Denali, Grand Canyon, and they pushed for scientific management and pushing like the Yellowstone Protection Act, the Lacey Act, which made it illegal to transport wildlife interstate, and Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and so forth. And it was kind of an interesting thing that to be a member of the Boone and Crockett Club, you had to kill 3 big game animals in North America, but you also had to support the idea of national parks. So it's this dichotomy which was out there. And a lot had to do with Teddy Roosevelt, who had the same kind of attitudes about wildlife. But 1882, General Phil Sheridan was the first person to advocate Yellowstone's park expansion. He wanted to add 40 miles to the east and 10 miles to the south. And it led to the creation of the Yellowstone Park and Timberland Reserve in 1891. So this was essentially the first national forest in the country. They didn't call it that, but that's what it was. And it's now part of the North Absaroka Wilderness. And parks and forests were not popular in the West. 1897 reaction of Western politicians to the creation of forest reserve. One Western senator said the president might as well have torn up the Constitution because the president by executive order was declaring all these places be made national forests. So these are a couple of quotes from Western newspapers. Now the avowed policy of the United States no longer hold its land as a source of income and profit. They should probably be turned over to the states. You know, do we hear this today? All of which can safely be trusted to deal with them to serve the best interest of the people. And then another one, why should we be everlastingly and eternally harassed and annoyed and bedeviled by these scientific gentlemen? Senator Wilson demanded. They admit they have no knowledge and that they hurried through the country in Pullman Palace cars. He said, as if to add and remind his colleagues that the East was too impractical and a feat to be trusted with the responsibility. So it's an interesting thing that the same dynamics we hear today. You know, it's like we don't want people from California and New York telling us what to do out here, right? It's been going on for a long time. Teddy Roosevelt was an amazing guy. I'm just finishing up a biography, as I can highly recommend, by Douglas Brinkley. But he set aside 230 million acres of public lands as wildlife refuges, as national parks, national monuments, bird reserves, etc. And then the whole time was he loved to kill stuff too. This is this irony with Teddy Roosevelt. He was really big into, you know, big game hunting, but he was open to things. For example, he came to Yellowstone. He was going to go hunting wolves in Yellowstone, and he got to Yellowstone, and this is the time when the Army was still there, and he met with the captain or whoever was the Army guy there, and he found out that there were a lot of elk in Yellowstone. He said, well, I guess there's no need to kill whales anymore, so we'll stop killing predators. You know, so he was open to learning stuff too. And he started the Grand Canyon. I got lots of stories about Teddy Roosevelt, really great, but like they passed the Antiquities Act in 1906. And Roosevelt wanted to protect the Grand Canyon. There was uranium mining going on, there was logging, all kinds of stuff. And the local congressmen and senators at that time, well, representatives, it was still a territory, were against any kind of protection for it. So he called up his attorney general and he says, is there anything in this law that has a size limit? And they said, no. He said, well, I declare that over 1 million acres of the Grand Canyon is now a national monument. And that was how he acted all the time. Like another fun story was Congress got tired of him designating national forests and all this stuff. So they passed a law saying you can't do it anymore without congressional approval. And so he knew he could not, if he vetoed it, it would be overridden. He knew he didn't have enough votes to uphold his veto. So he called Gifford Pinchot into the White House, and they stayed up all night drawing lines on a Western map, and he declared 16 million acres of new national forests, and then he signed the bill saying he wasn't allowed to do it anymore. So the Congress wakes up in the morning and they see, oh, he signed the bill. Oh, this is great. Then they learn that there's all these new national forests. He made 9 of them in Oregon alone and about 4 or 5 here in Montana. So anyway, and at that time, Teddy Roosevelt was working with Gifford Pinchot, and Pinchot was the first head of the Forest Service, and he gets a bad rap from some people because he actually was a pretty progressive guy, and he advocated conservation. Those who come after us will have to pay the price of misery, degradation, and failure for the progress and prosperity of our day. And I think that's pretty, you know, shows a lot of foresight. But he was in conflict with John Muir, and they had different opinions about stuff. So John Muir, as you may know, started the Sierra Club and also was a big advocate for national parks like Yosemite and Kings Canyon, Sequoia, etc. And he and Pinchot separated over this whole issue of forest reserves. When forest reserves were first created, they were like national parks. There was no logging, you couldn't hunt in them, and so forth. And then Pinchot realized that, especially as the opposition to national forests was rising, that if they opposed that, that they wouldn't get any more. So he agreed to allow some logging and some grazing. And John Muir was just furious. He's like, you know, I just can't believe that we're going to allow grazing in these places. He called them hoof locusts. And then I'm moving fast forward, but Bob Marshall, I bring him up because probably most of you have heard of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Bob Marshall was, he went to school back east and came out and got hired by the Forest Service in Missoula. And he spent a lot of time exploring the Mission Mountains, what is now the Bob Marshall Wilderness, Selway Bitterroot, and eventually went up to Alaska and spent a couple of years up in the Birch Range and wrote books about his experiences there. One of the things that Bob Marshall wrote back then, this is in the 1930s, he advocated that everything north of the Yukon River be made into one big national park. And, he liked to think big. And the irony is, if you look at a map of Alaska today, you have the Gatesy Ark National Park, you have the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, you have the Kobuk Valley National Park, you have the Noatak Preserve, you have the Koyukuk National Wildlife Refuge, the Kyantai Wildlife Refuge, Yukon Flat National Wildlife Refuge, and even the Naval Petroleum Reserve, which is going to get drilled now. But in general, if you look at a map, most of northern Alaska, north of the Yukon River, is in some protected status. Even those wildlife refuges I meant are designated wilderness. So he proposed this and people didn't forget about what Marshall was saying. And actually Marshall influenced me too, because when I was a sophomore in college over in Missoula, I had a roommate that had Marshall's book, Arctic Village, and my roommate was saying how great the Birch Range was. And I remember looking at the pictures saying, God, it looks pretty desolate to me. But anyway, I wound up trying to hitchhike to Alaska that summer. And irony, I ran out of money and I went down to Anchorage and I got hired by the BLM. And they said, what can you do? I said, I'll do anything. They said, you ever surveyed before? I said, well, I had trigonometry in college. That's about angles. So they hired me. And they said, you got to be at the airport at 8 o'clock in the morning. Here's your ticket. I said, where am I going? They said, Cayena. Where's that? Well, it's up north someplace. How long am I going to be there? I don't know. Just be prepared. So I went to the Salvation Army, bought a bunch of extra clothes. I went to a bookstore, got some books. And Cayena, turns out, was up in the Birch Range. So my very first real experience in Alaska was to be in the Birch Range, which Bob Marshall had written about. Anyway, early wildlife practices in Yellowstone, we're back to Yellowstone, included feeding bears at the dump and killing predators. And so, making it a park benefited some wildlife, but there were practices that were not great. But the good thing about the National Park Service is that their mission is to preserve natural features, and the agency tends to favor land and wildlife protection. So it has been a leader in conservation and preservation over the years. So, for example, it protected predators and restored wolves. That was because of Adolph Murray, who studied coyotes there, who came to the conclusion that coyotes weren't a threat to any of the wildlife, and he recommended that they stop killing coyotes and other predators. There weren't wolves anymore. They'd already been killed off. But that was the start. And that was in the 1930s. And then they eliminated feeding bears at the dump. That was a whole big controversy with the Craighead brothers that went on. They've set aside significant parts of the park as bear management areas where no one can travel unless you got a special permit. So they've even set aside, if you look at a map of the bear management areas, about a quarter of Yellowstone is off limits to people just hiking and stuff. You can go there in the wintertime when the bears are in hibernation, but they basically set aside about 500,000 acres. That's just, this is where the bears can be and not be hassled. It adopted a snowmobile control policy. Another story, the first time I went to Yellowstone, I was, again, my sophomore year at college, and I spent a month in Yellowstone with a class field trip. And we lived at the dorms up at Mammoth and travel around. And back then, this would have been the winter of 71, 72, there was virtually no snowmobiles in Yellowstone then. And, and then it exploded and now it's been controlled. You got to have a guide if you're in a snowmobile and so forth. They stopped the stocking of non-native fish. There was times when they put Chinook salmon in Yellowstone Lake. They didn't take, but they were trying to, brook trout and stuff like that. Now they have a native fish restoration. And it was the first public lands agency to value of wildfire and promote fire's ecological process. And most of the park is unofficial wilderness. Only 1% of the land is really developed, the roads and Old Faithful and so forth. So the question is, do protected areas like national parks work to protect biodiversity? And one study that looked at 86 other studies, what we call a review study, concluded, we find that protected areas generally have higher abundances of individual species and higher assemblages of abundance and higher species richness values and alternate land uses. And so they looked at studies from all around the world. And, you know, you can find things wrong with protected areas. They're too small, they're not well funded, there's poaching goes on and so forth. But nevertheless, on the whole, they tend to be the gold standard for conservation and a response to human arrogance and dominance. This is up in the Gates of the Arctic. That's my daughter. I took her up there about 3 summers ago, and we hiked in some of the areas that I had worked in previously, which was fun to go back. And that was another important point. You know, the first time I was in the Gates of the Arctic was 1974. And so I go back to the same place. I hadn't been there since 1974, and it basically looked the same. And that's the advantage of these protected areas. You know, you can come back many, many years later, and there's essentially the same, other than, you know, maybe a wildfire has come through or whatever. So we hear that Yellowstone is being loved to death, but that's sort of an exaggeration because the roads are crowded, but not the park. And there are ways to deal with crowds. You know, in some national parks, like down in Zion, they have a bus system, so does Denali, and so forth. So we could deal with that if we wanted to. The fact that you can't find a parking spot at Old Faithful or whatever doesn't necessarily mean the park is being degraded. Most of the park has fewer people, this is statistically shown, fewer people in the backcountry today than there was in the 1970s. So, you know, in terms of what's out there in the landscape, it's less. So what are the most important values of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem? I call them the 3 W's: watershed, wildlife, and wildlands. This is, you know, we got all these other things going on: livestock raising, logging, and mining, and oil and gas, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But those things you can do in other places, but you don't have a place like the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem any place else in the United States or in the world. And it doesn't make sense to be doing these other things that degrade it and degrade the ecological processes when those are the best things. So it's not the nation's wood box, feedlot, thrill class craft gymnasium, mineral box, or energy well, in my view. And the future of Greater Yellowstone ecosystem lies not in the park, but what happens in the surrounding public and private lands. And we got a road problem. You can see how, what I was talking about Yellowstone. I mean, that's the center part here. You see Yellowstone Lake, that big blue. There isn't a lot of roads in Yellowstone Park itself, but look at what's around Yellowstone Park. The place is, you know, pretty much roaded up. And logging in the Yellowstone ecosystem is justified to reduce large fires and restore historical conditions. These are euphemisms. And, you know, one of my special areas of expertise is wildfires. So I have to tell you that there's lots of studies that shows that thinning the forest does not stop fires during extreme fire weather. And that's an important point because all the large fires that you're trying to stop happen during extreme fire weather. To make an analogy, it might be saying like building levees like they did in New Orleans that survived hurricanes that were category 2 and 3 on a hurricane scale. And then Katrina, Hurricane 5 comes through and all the levees fail. So we're trying to stop big wildfires by thinning and these kind of activities. And it's the category 5 equivalent of a hurricane fire that burns through all that stuff. And another problem with all this thinning and stuff is the probability that any place will be touched by a fire is very small, 1 to 2%. And the other part of it has to do with carbon. There's studies that show, like for example, in Oregon, a study done there showed that about 4% of the carbon emitted annually now is from wildfires. But logging emits 35% of the carbon. It's the biggest factor of carbon emissions in Oregon. And the reason for that is when you have a wildfire, as you see in this picture here, you've got the trees are still left there. The roots are still left there. The charcoal in the ground is still left there. That's all carbon being stored. So even a fire you don't lose that. So well, here's the statistic about the carbon emissions that I mentioned, 4% roughly compared to logging. So what do you do to deal with the fire issue around the West? I think you need to treat the area right around the homes. And again, I'll make an analogy with the hurricanes. And Florida. We're not going to stop hurricanes in Florida. We're not going to stop these big fires because it's climate driven. So what do? Well, if you're in Florida, first of all, you don't build your house right next to the ocean and, 1 or 2 feet above sea level. You can do things like reinforce the windows, put shutters up so when the wind blows and so forth. We can do the same thing with houses here. Like a metal roof is a big factor. If you have a metal roof, 95% of the fires are not going to affect you because most houses catch on fire from embers that are being blown. So, keep your gutters free of debris. Keep any vents screened. Maybe you keep 5 or 6 feet away from the house foundation, free of debris and so forth. So there's standard things that you can do that will prevent a fire from getting your house. And as you can see in this picture, some of the houses in the background didn't burn and this house burned down. This was the Waldo Canyon fire in Colorado. The real issue there is, where are we spending our money? The federal government would be much better helping people fireproof their homes or fireproof them as much as they could than doing all this thinning and logging. All right, another thing we got to deal with is protect migration corridors. And this map on the left shows the elk migration routes out of Yellowstone, because they get so much snow in the wintertime, a lot of animals don't spend time there except down near Gardner in that area. So they migrate out to where there's less snow and more forage available. And we're cutting off those things. All those roads I showed you in the map interfere with that migration. And what they've found in places like up in the Canadian Rockies, that you can build these overpasses and the animals learn to use them. This is actually near Arlee, just north of Missoula. They've got a few of them there, but there's a whole lot up in the Canadian Rockies. Highway 1, the most used highway corridor in all Canada, has a bunch of these across it, and grizzly bears, wolverine, elk, and so forth have all used them. Down in the southern part of the ecosystem, down in Wyoming, they put in these sensors to sense when animals are approaching the highway, and then the lights start flashing, slow down, and that has saved the lives of a lot of animals and allowed them to migrate through. So there's different ways you could deal with it, but a really good one would to put a couple in here by Bozeman Pass between here and Livingston, for example, and down in the highway below Big Sky going to West Yellowstone. And we need to get going with that right away. The other point is that recreation can have an impact too. It's not necessarily conservation. The more roads, the more trails, the more access can shrink wildlife security. So for example, there's been studies that show, even a hiker will displace somewhat wildlife, but then mountain bikes, it's like 3 times the distance. Motorcycles, even more, snowmobiles and so forth. So the more intensive the use as well as the kind of use affects how that has an influence on wildlife. And most everybody doesn't think about that very much. But even this road, like that road closure is a good example. There was a study done near Missoula, I remember years ago, and they showed, not surprisingly, that hunters like to walk the logging roads. So even though you got a fence across it, you now have new access into terrain. I'm that way. When I go on there, I don't want to be on the side of a hillside slipping and sliding. I go up the road. That's me in the picture. So so that actually increases the access and then potentially can disturb wildlife. So I like this quote from Aldo Leopold. Recreational development is not a job of building roads into lovely country, but building receptivity in the still unlovely human mind. So that's what we got to start emphasizing more, rather than let's build more roads and so forth. Now, another impact on the ecosystem is livestock grazing. It's probably the most pervasive activity. And it does lots of damage. You got riparian damage, like the picture on the left there. There's no shrubs along that stream that's been trampled. It's probably wider than it used to be, and it's got shallower, so it's less suitable for fish. You have forage competition. There's studies that show that when the cattle come onto an allotment, the elk go someplace else. So if you presume that they were there because it was good, when they get displaced, you're displacing them in less suitable habitat. You got soil compaction, you got water pollution, the killing of predators, CO2 emissions, the bison slaughter. The Upper Green River, this is a picture on the right, the Upper Green River down in Wyoming. There was a recent lawsuit. It's the biggest Forest Service allotment in the West. And the Forest Service has come out and said they're going to continue to graze there, and they're going to allow up to 72 grizzlies be killed in the next 10 years. Already 39 grizzlies have been killed on this allotment already. And, you know, and so you have this sort of, you start saying, you're shaking your head, you're okay, we're saying that we have to protect grizzly bears, and yet we're going to allow that many possibly get killed just so somebody can graze their cattle. There's 10 ranchers that graze that allotment. It has two effects. One is when their cattle die, sometimes that's sort of like the entranceway drug. You know, you're a grizzly bear, you come along, you find a dead cow, and you say, not too bad. And then the next thing you do, you attack a live cow. So it can lead to more depredation that way. Another thing that's going on is particularly down in Wyoming is oil development. I took this picture on the left. That's near Pinedale, Wyoming. Look at all the roads and landings and so forth. Tremendous amount of impact. And the reason this is really important is that Upper Green River going down is a major migration zone for both pronghorn and elk and mule deer and so forth. And they're getting more and more congested or tightened area where they can move freely because of all the oil development. And the Biden administration is going to lease some more oil. And I don't know if it's in this area, but it definitely around the West, we're going to see more oil development for that reason. And that's having an effect. Oh, well, this map shows you here. I didn't know if I had it. Anyway, you can see how where Pinedale is in the map, and the mule deer is the yellow and the pronghorn is the blue. And you can just see how the roads are crimping in. And then the map on the right shows where all the different oil patches potentially are down in that part of the ecosystem. So you see Jackson and Pinedale as markers of where it is. And then this stuff out here by Rock Springs and this green stuff, that's the Red Desert, which is also the largest unfenced area of public land left in the United States, and an area that I think should also be protected in some way. Unfortunately, Wyoming, when Grand Teton National Park was established, Congress passed a law saying no more national monuments can be declared in Wyoming. It's the only state you can't do that in. So you can't go to Biden or somebody and say, hey, make it a national monument. You can do that in every other state, but you can't do that in Wyoming. And so, you know, maybe you could declare it a wildlife refuge or something, but the Red Desert should really get some protection. It's a tremendous area for wildlife. And then we have this ongoing thing with bison right by Gardner. And one of the problems with it, no matter how you feel about the tribes killing the bison, is it removes the bison. It's having ecological effects. The bison most likely to migrate are the ones that are getting killed. And we want the bison to move out of the park. We want it to go into other public lands. And it removes biomass, the food that would feed grizzlies, wolves, ravens, and other wildlife too. Because if you presume if there wasn't the killings there, some of those animals would die in the park, or they'd be easy to kill, as the case may be. And it may even have some genetics reducing the overall effective population, because, you know, bison are tournament breeders. So you have one bull might breed, you know, 10 cows or something like that. So the genetic diversity is somewhat reduced, and it may impact bison social bonds too. The other thing that's happening is, as I don't have to tell anybody probably in here, is land development. And more and more people are moving to this region, and you can understand why. I think who wouldn't want to live around here with wildlife so abundant, with beautiful mountains, with all these recreational opportunities. But we also have some major things like Big Sky that, you know, some of you know that I write a lot of letters to the editor and stuff. And my very first letter to the editor that I wrote was about Big Sky before it was developed. I wrote a letter to the editor saying, if they develop Big Sky, it's going to have a big impact on wildlife movements and stuff. This was like 1972 or something. I wrote that. I never wrote a letter to the editor before, but I just was motivated to do it. And so that was my first public comment. Anyway, but there are solutions to this. We don't have to necessarily accept it. Land use planning and zoning, and most people don't know that Oregon has statewide zoning. Even the smallest town, a town like the size of Clyde Park or Three Forks or whatever, is required to have an urban growth boundary, and you cannot subdivide outside that urban growth boundary. And the urban growth boundary can be enlarged as population increases. So it's not a permanent marker. But this picture I took from the air, this is in the Willamette Valley. Look at that square, and it's because of the urban growth boundary. And you can see that in a lot of places. And there's other advantages to urban growth boundaries besides just on wildlife. For example, since you know where there's going to be development, you can predict in advance where you need roads and how many roads and how wide the roads are. Because you know, if you're going to have 1,000 new houses, that's going to be X number of people and X number of cars. And you can even build schools. There was in Bend, Oregon, where I lived part of the time, they just built a new high school. And they built it before there was any students there. But they built it because they knew that was part of the town that was in the urban growth boundary that had expanded. And within a few years, they're going to have lots of people living there. So they built the school in advance. So you can plan that kind of stuff. I don't need to harp on this, and it's not my main point, but wildlife and wildlands are essential to the economy of this region. And the only thing I want to point out is how little timber and agriculture and that kind of thing contributes to the economy. People don't realize it. I remember years ago, I lived in Livingston for a whole lot of years. And I remember there was a report in the paper about how they had questioned people and said, well, what are the most important things driving the economy around Livingston and Park County? And they said, well, it's the timber industry, it's mining, it's ranching, and it's farming. Well, at that time, less than 4% of the employment in Park County was for all of those things, all of them. And yet that was the impression people have, because you go out and you see a lot of ranch land, you think that's a big job creator, but it's not really. So we have a situation where we have a chance to set aside a good portion of the earth. And E.O. Wilson, who is a conservation biologist, very famous biologist, recently died. He says that people haven't been thinking big enough, even conservationists. And I was on the board of, actually, Doug Tompkins, who I pictured at the beginning, got a bunch of us together at his home in San Francisco years ago, and we formed something called the Wildlands Project. And our goal was to come up with big ideas about protecting wildlands. And one of them was the Yukon to Yellowstone campaign, for example. But that is the way we need to start thinking about these things, is really big. What can we do? So like on the Custer-Gallatin National Forest, to bring it home, there's over 800,000 acres of roadless lands that could be designated as additional wilderness we could protect. And again, what's the most important use of this area? What can you argue has the greatest benefit to society over the long term? Wilderness, wildlife, and wildlands. And yet that's not the emphasis of the forest plan. And one place in particular is the Gallatin Range, starting from here, going down into Yellowstone Park. Electric Peak by Gardner is part of the Gallatin Range. It's the largest unprotected roadless lands in the ecosystem. And much of it's already been logged and roaded. So we need to protect what's left of that land. This is, by the way, from Ramshorn Peak looking south towards Electric Peak. That's Electric Peak up there at the top highest peak, Tom Minor Basin. Isn't that gorgeous? I mean, Jesus. Anyway, in 1977, Senate Bill 393 protected approximately 155,000 acres of the highlight porcupine buffalo horn wilderness study area. Now, that law protected 10 other roadless areas around the state. But this is what it said: the wilderness study areas designated by this act shall, and that's an important word, shall means you don't have any discretion. It says you will do this. And it says to be administered by the Secretary of Agriculture so as to maintain the presently existing wilderness character and potential inclusion in the National Wilderness Preservation System. Well, unfortunately, the Forest Service has not done its job. I think they've illegally allowed all kinds of compromises to this area. So, for example, when that was passed in 1977, I can tell you there was no mountain bikes in 1977 around here, but now, like this buffalo horn porcupine drainages have lots of mountain bikes. That shouldn't be allowed. There was very few dirt bikes back then in 1977. There were a few, but not a lot. Snowmobiles didn't have the power they have now to go to places. And the Forest Service has allowed all these things to compromise this area. This is looking out towards the porcupine drainage out there. And then in the background, those mountains, that's the Lee Metcalf Wilderness and the Madison Range. So we need to start, we could start right in our backyard, protecting the Gallatin Range. That could be a prime goal of everybody here, hopefully. We'll work towards that goal. But this is why I think it's important to do these things. Protected areas rewild ourselves. They provide a chance to rebut old narratives about dominion, conquest, colonization. They offer a new story about communion, reciprocity, humility, wonder, and reverence. And so that's one of the sort of philosophical values I see of protecting wildlands. They are also a way to pay our debt to the earth. You know, all of us have benefited from resource extraction and exploitation. And we have some, I think, a responsibility and obligation to give back a little bit to, you know, that we benefited from all this exploitation. And one of the ways we can do that is, of course, protecting lands. And it's not all about us either. A lot of discussions are about people, you know, I'm a mountain biker or I'm a snowmobiler or whatever, and I want to have a chance to use this land. But it's really, we have to start thinking about more than us on these discussions. And I like this quote from Ed Abbey: "The love of wilderness is more than a hunger for what is always beyond reach. It is an expression of loyalty to the earth, a earth which bore us and sustained us, and the only home we shall ever know, the only paradise we ever need, if we only had eyes to see." And it also is about discipline and self-restraint. It's a statement that we're, you know, if we can't protect places like Greater Yellowstone, are we that poor? I mean, they quote say we're the richest country in the world and we can't protect the whole ecosystem. Give me a break. We have lots of opportunities. So there's different ways we could do this. One is the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act. That's one possible solution. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it would designate nearly all the roadless areas, over 23 million acres in this region. It goes into Oregon, Washington, a lot of Wyoming, and of course Montana, and it tries to protect all those areas. Another thing is, I think we could expand Yellowstone National Park. You could make it, part of it could be a national park preserve, which would allow certain things like hunting to proceed, perhaps. A lot of the parks in Alaska are like that, like the Gates of the Arctic where I worked, it's called Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. So there's areas where you can hunt in it. But it's just not any land. This is the best of the best. The Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem should be, in my view, designated a national monument or an expanded national park under the National Park Service. And we look at how the other agencies, the BLM and the Forest Service, first of all, they do not have the legal mechanisms. They don't have the mandate that the National Park Service has for protecting land. They have a mandate to do things like allow logging or livestock grazing and so forth. And they don't have the motivation because there's a lot of good people that work for these agencies, and I know them, but they're under pressure from Congress and politicians and Chamber of Commerce or whatever to allow oil and gas drilling or allow the grazing of the Upper Green River and so forth. You have a different mandate under those agencies. So we could expand this. Just think of a Greater Yellowstone National Park that was 28 million acres in size. That would really be something in the world. It would show that we really care about things. And I like this quote from the late Representative Elijah Cummings: "Our children are the living messages we send to the future we will never see. Will we rob them of their destiny? Will we rob them of their dreams? Our time is too short not to fight for what's good and what is true and what is best in America." And I think protecting the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem fits that mandate really well. These are my kids, by the way. We did a week-long trip in the Teton Wilderness, and my son found this elk antler, and he carried it all the way, 16 miles the last day. He carried that thing, and it sits in my front yard right now. I still have it there. So anyway, wilderness and parks preserve habitat for others like forest elves, and I just like to push this idea further that this is about more than just us. It's about all the life on Earth. And if we make this effort, you know, it's a whole change in thinking about how you live on the planet, I think, that could result. And that's what we need to do. We have to change our way of living and the way we think about things. And we're a better place to start than in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much, very, very much. It was so wonderful and so interesting. Thank you, George. So now we're going to have a question and answer period. And so I'll be going to Rich every once in a while to see if we have questions from our online audience. But I just wanted to start and see who had a question here in our live audience. If you just want to raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone here to you so you can ask the question. So looking around and no one yet. So Rich, do we have any? No questions, I guess.
Okay.
Okay, I see one. So I'm going, I don't want to go in front of the camera, so I'm going around.
By the way, when I took this picture of my kids here, this is a fun story. I was working on this book about wildfire, and we spent 2 summers traveling around all around the West looking at fires and stuff. And my daughter, who you see in that picture, when we got back to home, she was talking to a couple of schoolmates that after the summer, and they were talking, and one said, well, I went to the coast and for 2 weeks, and I was on the beach and everything. And the other one said, oh, I went to camp, I learned to canoe and stuff. So what'd you do, Summer? She said, well, I went with my dad looking at burnt forests all around the West.
Okay, here is our first question. And
thank you. Many of the solutions that you put forward are technically quite viable. So what is your suggestion to make them politically?
That's the $64,000 question politically. My experience has been 2 things. One, you have to first articulate these ideas, and they may brew and simmer and so forth for a long time. Like I mentioned, Bob Marshall saying everything north of the Yukon River be wilderness and parks. It took 50 years. I hope it doesn't take that long here, but nevertheless, the point being is that first you have to have the vision out there, and then over time you try to sell people on that vision. We're changing our attitudes on a lot of these things that were, you know, like I mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt was blasting animals left and right. If he were alive today, I'm almost 100% sure that he would have just been a bird watcher, probably, just because of the changing in values that are happening. So we have to work on changing people's values and perceptions, and try to, as I try to in this talk, to first of all make you aware of how special this place is. This is not emulated any place else in the world. And so if you see it as unique, then you got to, hopefully people start to say, this is something we need to work on to maintain and preserve into the future. So it's not something I can give you a date on or anything like that, but it does work over time. I'll give you one more story. I'm the president of a group called Restore the North Woods. And back in 1992, we came up with the concept of creating a 3.2 million acre national park in the Maine woods. We started promoting it, and everybody laughed at us. You know, it's like, what a joke this is. But in Obama administration, well, first of all, we got a woman named Roxanne Quimby, heard about our idea. She owned Burt's Bees, and she liked the idea of having a park in the Maine woods. So we worked with her to buy up land in the Maine woods from private timber companies. And during the Obama administration, he made it a national monument. And this was in 2016 or 15, somewhere in that area. And at that time, the governor and both senators in Maine were all against it. They said this is just like the quote I had about Bozeman saying that the economy was going to be ruined here. Well, just this last year, both senators in Maine have introduced legislation to double the size of this national monument. So the point being is that over time, you know, these ideas pick up and you make progress. You know, we don't have 3.2 million acres preserved there yet, but we're not giving up on it. So it's
very interesting. Okay, we have another question here.
George, you're my hero.
Oh, hey, Todd.
Nobody's written more. Nobody's gone at it harder than you for, 50 years. So my question is twofold. What was, for the kids who are tuned in tonight, what was your spark that got you going to move from just being a user of public lands to being an advocate and activist? And then similarly, what is it that keeps you going today as an elder?
Well, with me, it started pretty young. When I was in middle school, this area, which was very close to my house, it was a woodlands. I called it bird paradise. The first thing I was interested in was birds, and I learned all the birds down there. And then a developer came in and bulldozed down all the trees and built a bunch of houses there. And that was just a traumatic experience to me. My bird paradise was eliminated. And so that was sort of my first, sense of that things could change and not be good for wildlife. And another funny story is I was always interested in the outdoors and Indians and trappers and all that stuff. And I remember reading these books about game trails. And I hate to admit this to people, but I grew up in New Jersey. So I was, and I read about game trails, and I was like, what's this about? I didn't see any game trails around where I lived. And so I came out to the University of Montana to go to school, and I see game trails all around. So it was sort of that introduction into that being in the outdoors. And the thing that I loved about being in Montana, particularly going to U of M, is all these issues are important all the time. I went to graduate school down in Santa Cruz, for example, and you didn't see in the papers about grizzly bears or elk or anything like that, but this is issues here. We read about it all the time. So that kind of was the spark. And I guess, to answer your question, what keeps me going is I just find it fascinating to read about this stuff, to learn about it, to be outdoors. I have a story from my mom. When I was a little baby, and I started to cry, she'd throw me outside in the bassinet, and I'd stop crying right away. So I don't know, maybe it's genetic. And one more connection that's pretty interesting. I was born at Buffalo Crossroads, Pennsylvania, which is where the last buffalo in Pennsylvania was killed. So I have that kind of maybe a connection that way. Who knows?
Very cool. Okay, I guess we have an online question. Rich?
Yes, thank you. Isabel asks, do you believe it is within human capacity to designate areas where no humans are allowed?
Well, actually, I hate to tell you where that has happened, but the old Soviet Union had large expanses where nobody was allowed to go. And because they could just control everybody, they could get away with it. I forget what they called it, they had some special name. Only scientists were allowed to go there. I don't know if you could say that, but my main thing I would say is if you make the access difficult, you will not get a lot of use. When I worked up in the Gates National Park in Alaska, we were writing the management plan for it. And one of the things I advocated was that they outlaw airplanes, because everybody goes around by airplane up there. And Bob Marshall didn't go by airplane. He just kind of hauled boats up the rivers and did dog sleds in the winter. I can guarantee you there wouldn't be a whole lot of people going in the Gates if they had to walk everywhere and couldn't fly. Not that it gets a lot of use anyway, but the point is that like that example of the road that bulldozed road, and hunters go up the roads, people go up the roads. The more we make of that, then the less territory the animals have that they're not disturbed. So I think it's possible, but you're going uphill in a lot of ways, fighting people's desires.
Okay, Elizabeth asks, can you comment on the progress of American Prairie, making a large protected area in central Montana? It seems to parallel the early efforts of protecting Yellowstone.
Yeah, for those that don't know about it, the American Prairie Reserve is buying up land from willing sellers, and that's an important point, out along the area north of the Missouri River. And that area has several other large public lands holdings. You've got the Missouri Breaks National Monument and the Charles M. Russell Wildlife Refuge. Probably not a better place in the lower 48 states where we could have establish a wild herd of bison between that. And part of what the American Prairie Reserve is doing is trying to buy up all the private lands that are mixed in with those public lands. And their eventual goal is sort of like ours in Maine with the Restore the North Woods. They want to make a 3 million acre preserve for bison and other wildlife there. And they're really moving forward with it. They've got a lot of resistance from some of the local people. It's kind of interesting. This is not the first time, you may not be familiar, but there was a talk I forget what his name was, but some guy from Hamilton who was a rancher who advocated that the ranchers out there all give up cattle and have bison. And then there was the Potters who were professors at Rutgers who talked about the big open or bison preserve out there in Dakota and eastern Montana. And they showed that the ranchers could make more money if they just gave up ranching and pooled their resources and have bison. But the reaction to that, I remember reading about it, was like, well, we're cowboys, we're not bison boys. And so there's this sort of cultural resistance to that kind of a change. But at the same time, if you go out there, a lot of those ranchers, this is all around the West, but a lot of the ranchers are getting older. A lot of them have moved to places like Billings or Lewistown, and they get some ranch manager that operates the ranch, and their kids don't want to be there. I have a couple old girlfriends. That's a good example. One grew up on a ranch in North Dakota, 5 daughters. Not one of them wanted to stay on the ranch, And the ranch has been sold to other ranchers, but the point being is that that is not an attractive lifestyle for a lot of people. So that's who is being bought out. A lot of them are saying, this is my retirement fund, and I think they're going to succeed, but there's local resistance to it.
Thank you. Another question here.
I'd like to make a comment about until 1978, the nerve on trespass. The entire Bozeman Creek drainage was closed.
Huh.
And now it's one of Bozeman bigger city parks.
Yeah.
I go up there, I'm 18 and crazy. It's like going to Yellowstone. There was elk everywhere. There's places you could fish. Big rings fell out,
Yeah.
But second example of that, my father worked county for 24 years. Before 1953, Richard Canyon was not plowed above Jackson. Somebody wanted to go up there. They did the cows out.
Yeah.
That development up there, because of Bridger Bowl, now we have big homes and ski areas. But before then, they waited until about March or April to plow that stinker out. It took several days to get over to Savannah. So we've lost things around here, let alone worry about losing things other places. That's just what I want to say about your comment. I like these closed areas.
I really want to emphasize what he just said, and to the whole audience, one of the real values that I think of older people is we have some of the history that maybe younger people don't know about. And so it's really important to, I like to read a lot of history from 100 years ago, but even the elder statesmen, you might say, from the region have a lot of history to give and knowledge that of what has happened in the past. And because people, again, this landscape amnesia, that's what you're talking about. People today don't realize that Bridger Canyon was that way because we can't imagine it. I'm going to tell one more story, personal story. When I lived in Vermont for a short time, and shortly after I got there, I went to a fish and game meeting where they were talking about logging a wildlife management area. And everybody there was saying, well, we need to log it because we want to make early successional habitat for white-tailed deer, as if white-tailed deer are rare in Vermont. And finally, this guy gets up and he says, the real problem is the old growth problem. And I'm like, finally, somebody I can connect with. And then he goes on and says, yeah, we have too many old trees here. We need to log them. And so and you go around Vermont and there are what I call, pole-sized trees. And the biggest trees in Vermont are left in cemeteries and in front of old farmhouses. You don't see them in the woods because all of Vermont was logged. And so people in Vermont think that Vermont is really great because it's got forest everywhere, but it's not the forest that used to exist there. And that's the landscape amnesia kind of thing. Okay, go on.
Okay, one more question here. We're just about done.
Yeah, George, you've really driven home the idea of how special the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is. I've begun developing the idea that the whole 23 million acres should be a national park.
Yep.
The obstacle to that, of course, is that a lot of the land right now is managed by the Forest Service. Do you think that the Forest Service is capable and demonstrating a commitment to restore, not to restore, but to maintain this incredibly special place?
Well, I sort of answered that with some of these land uses, the logging like that's going to happen by West Yellowstone and grizzly habitat, the South Plateau, logging sale, the Kirk Hill right up above here. Go up there and see what was logged. You know, it practically looks like clear cut. They don't call it a clear cut because it's called a shelter wood cut or some other euphemism for those kinds of things. But the point is the pressure, and I want to say that a lot of these employees that work for the agencies are really sympathetic to a lot of the same goals that we have, but they're under political pressure to do these things that maybe they know are not really in the best condition for the landscape, but they don't have a choice. So that's where I'm saying the National Park Service, because its mandate is different and has a different mission, might be more appropriate in this particular area to set up a large, as we say, national park or national park and preserve. That would be my vision. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this will be our last question right here.
Thank you. George, you covered a lot of ground. All these issues come down to a lot of politics. The Forest Service is a political animal, for example.
Right.
And what I see, and I think what you see as well, is that the major environmental groups around the country, especially at the national level, are backing away from issues of preservation and nature and taking maybe the easier, I don't know what, politically easier anyway, short-term issues, and not leading the public to be concerned, to understand, to be concerned, and to support the kinds of issues that you and E.O. Wilson and others are promoting. Maybe you comment on that a bit.
Well, I think that's an accurate assessment. I'm very disappointed in a lot of the national groups anymore in terms of their timidness and unwillingness to advocate for big protected areas. And, you know, to reference back to Doug Tompkins, who I work for, who was an amazing guy. But he told his story one of the first times I met him. He said that he was a businessman. He said, in business, we see a lot of new companies get started by somebody who's creative and starts something, a new way of doing thing, or makes a new product or whatever. And over time, they get sort of solidified where they're more worried about not challenging anything, and they often get rid of the creative person who started that business, the stockholders and so forth. And he said the same thing happens in environmental groups, conservation groups. And I've seen that same trend where the groups, you know, I mean, take something like the Wilderness Society started by Bob Marshall, you know, advocating everything north of the Yukon. Can you imagine the Wilderness Society today saying, well, let's make everything in all of southern Utah wilderness area? You know, they're timid about doing stuff like that because of the politics. So we need visionary proposals out there, and maybe that's where we need occasionally you get, just like new companies come up, new conservation organizations come forth and start advocating those kinds of visions. But it is a real problem, I think, today than compared to even when I was a, you know, young person and, you know, in organizations. I just got a thing, giving an example from the Sierra Club, saying I've been a member for 35 years and I'm not going to be a member next year because I think they've kind of lost their way. And so it's kind of that kind of thing. A lot of the organizations I used to support, I don't have a lot of faith in them anymore. And I hope there'll be you know, a new way of looking, because we've got real serious problems to deal with. And I didn't make this point about the forest, but I want to emphasize it here. You know, we could store a lot of carbon in our forests if we stop logging the public lands. If you put all the public lands off limits to logging, actually public lands only provide like 3 or 4% of our wood anyway. That we would store lots and lots of carbon there. in those public lands. And the same with more parks and so forth. And that would deal somewhat with the climate warming, which is a big issue we face right now. So.
Very good. Thank you so much. I have one quick question that I
Okay.
wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Are there any national groups that you like, and on a positive note?
Well, all right. Yeah, I like the Center for Biodiversity because they're pretty hard-nosed about trying to protect things, and they're not afraid to sue to try to use the courts to their advantage. The Wild Earth Guardians is similar. They're down in New Mexico, but they have offices around the West. And then locally, I like the Alliance for the Wild Rockies a whole lot. They're not timid, and it's only one guy, and it's amazing. You know, I look at some group like the Greater Yellowstone Coalition has what, 25 or 28 employees now, and then the Alliance has one guy, and one guy at the Alliance is doing more to protect wildlands in this state than 28 people working at the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, which, by the way, I used to work at too, and so did Todd. And you can find a lot of people who are a little disappointed that used to work there with how things are today. So that's it.
Well, thank you so much. I think everyone would like to thank you also.
All right.
Thank you. Got a microphone. I just wanted to let you know that there will be a recording of this talk available in a few days. If you happen to register for the talk, we'll send it to you automatically. If not, you can find it on our website at gallatinvalleyearthday.org. And once again, I encourage you to please join us for all of our Earth Day celebrations, starting actually next Thursday, April 20th at the Emerson. The Bozeman Doc series is partnering with us to show a fantastic film about wildlife, The Path of the Panther. It was produced by a local film company here. I think it's Grizzly Creek Productions. And so you probably don't want to miss that. That's again at the Emerson on Thursday, April 20th. On the 21st, there'll be a great Earth Day celebration at the Emerson for the under 30 crowd, sort of aimed at with music and food and games and a lot of fun for those guys. And then on Saturday, April 22nd, there's a threefer. You can start out the day with supporting the Earth Day Fun Run at 9 a.m. at the 100-acre park, which is again supporting our wetlands here, our Ingerland Audubon wetlands. And then head over to the festival at the Emerson at 10 o'clock. And we have 5 fantastic talks during the day. Every hour there's a different talk. And it starts out with a talk I think that you will really love. It's about bison by Dr. Jim Bailey, and that's at 10 a.m. at the Emerson. And you can look online to see about all the other great talks too, and all the exhibits going on, and short films, and music, and food. It's a great day. And then you can end the evening at the Emerson still with our Earth Day variety show. So hope to see you at some of that. And thank you all for coming. Good night. Oh, wait.
And Jim Bailey's book is out there if you want to take a look at it. It's a really good book on bison and what happened to him.
Thank you, George, again. Really enjoyed the evening.